John.
John Bentz is in the house.
And I've actually got a question for John.
Go ahead.
Once we get to fantasy football, but I'll let you.
No. This segment of fantasy football brought to you by BallparkSweaters.com. If you have a female baseball or softball fan in your life, think of a sweater for them. It makes a nice, great holiday gift. You can get one at BallparkSweaters.com, and they're inexpensive. Actually, Bob's wife wears one to all the Phillies games. Not that being a Philly fan is bad or anything like that, but his wife wears it. What about you, John? Does your wife wear one?
No, my wife doesn't have a ballpark sweater at this time. She's a little bit more of a football lady than a baseball lady. So we haven't found football sweaters. We haven't started selling football sweaters yet, but I'm sure once that starts, my wife will have one.
Okay, let's see. What do we want to talk about? Great moments in Turkey Day fantasy football. Do we want to start there?
Yeah, I think, this is kind of a strange week for fantasy football because we had 3 games on Thursday. Normally there's only 1. So there's a lot of teams have kind of already been set up for fantasy football. So we do have some real quick news and notes. But my favorite thing was looking over some of the historical records of performances on Thanksgiving Day. And I wanted to kind of make a couple notes here, pass along a couple notes related to that. Did you know that the first 300-yard receiving game and actually the highest individual scoring performance, both happened on Thanksgiving Day? These are NFL records, the first 300-yard receiving game and the most points scored. Those are 2 huge fantasy flips from Thanksgiving history. Both of them happened pre-1950. So I don't think there was a lot of fantasy football going on in the 50s or in the 40s or the 30s, but but Jim Benton, Hall of Fame wide receiver, actually logged 303 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns on Thanksgiving Day, 1945, against the Detroit Lions. That was the first 300-yard game in NFL, 300-yard receiving game in NFL history. And then Ernie Nevers, who I believe is a Hall of Fame football player as well, scored 6 touchdowns and kicked 4 extra points in 1929 against the Bears. Yeah. And put up 40 points. 40 points. That's without, I don't even think they were logging yardage at that time. They were just logging touchdowns. Huh. So from a fantasy perspective, that guy had 40 points off the bat. So anybody playing fantasy football, you can only imagine how good your 1929 squad would have been the week of Thanksgiving if you had Ernie Nevers running for you.
Didn't George Clooney play in Leatherheads or something like that on that or whatever? But Greg, can you give me some statistics of that I can even remember? And I'm old school myself, where you're somebody more recently, more into today's time period, huh?
Well, we can at least I guess the furthest back that I want to go is Bob Griese. Now, Bob Griese, I think lately is more famous for being in the booth, reporting in the booth for college football every weekend. But he was kind of like a Trent Dilfer type quarterback, right? He was there more to hand the ball off and make sure that his team didn't lose the game than he was to put up great passing numbers. But he actually, in 77, still going back in the vaults a little bit, 77, Thanksgiving against St. Louis, he threw 6 touchdowns. Bob Griese.
Wow.
6 touchdowns. So I think the rest of the season he may have had 7. So the fact that he put up one game was pretty remarkable. And then, the greatest, in my recollection, the greatest Thanksgiving fantasy football shootout of all time came in 1995 between the Lions and the Vikings. Warren Moon put up 384 yards passing and 3 touchdowns, and Scott Mitchell put up 410 yards with 4 touchdowns and 30 completions against Minnesota. I think the defenses probably had too much turkey before the game started, but that's probably the greatest fantasy football shootout from Thanksgiving Day history. So there's a little Thanksgiving Day history for you.
Okay, John Ben's in the house here on Spador on Sports. We're going to take a time out. We're going to be right back. We'll talk more fantasy sports, including the hottest wives in professional football, which is similar to the topic of the hottest wives in professional baseball. You're listening to Spador on Sports. Check out my website, SpadorOnSports.com. Okay, we're back here on Spador on Sports talking fantasy football, talking about the hottest wives of fantasy football. Okay, John, let me continue with you. Uncle Bob's in the house here. Let's talk a little bit about Week 12 fantasy football notes.
Well, we got a couple notes here this week. Last week we talked about we briefly touched on quarterbacks, and I did mention that Carson Palmer was probably my favorite quarterback if you were looking for somebody long term over the next 5 weeks. That said, Vince Young looks like he's going to be starting again for the Eagles against New England, and New England. I don't think New England has contained a quarterback all season. Their defense. Again, their defense has kind of been hung over all year. So Vince Young, who Bob liked last week, I'm going to take the lead from Bob that say Vince Young is probably your quarterback pickup this week in fantasy football if you need somebody. Obviously, if you have Mike Vick, you need a replacement. But if you have a guy like maybe Jay Cutler, if you have a guy like Chubb, you're going to need a quarterback. And if you're looking for a 1 week fill-in, Vince Young is probably your go-to guy this week. The matchup's friendly, and I think he's gonna put up good numbers against New England. And one other quick note: Jahvid Best has suffered a concussion, and he's going to be out for the remainder of the regular season. If you watched the Lions on Thanksgiving Day, you saw Kevin Smith put up a pretty decent performance. His legs seem to be fresh after a couple injury-riddled seasons here. So it looks like Kevin Smith is going to be your go-to guy running back for the Detroit Lions down the stretch. So if you're looking for a pickup, he's available in about 25% of fantasy leagues. You should be able to grab him if you need a spot play at running back or to replace Jahvid Best. So Kevin Smith from the Detroit Lions is your running back pickup this week.
John, Bob, I was just going to ask you guys, I have Fred Jackson, the Buffalo Bills running back on my team, and I was looking for another running back, and you guys just kind of answered that question. Is there maybe another running back that has kind of been flying under the radar this year that's been pretty consistent all year that it would be available in most leagues?
Well, the Patriots running back situation is always chancy. That said, you should be able to get one of their running backs off of your wire. So if you're looking for a guy, we've been talking about him for 20 years, but even a guy like Kevin Falk, he sometimes does get the ball in that scenario. But at this point in the year, unless you want to take a guy who's in a timeshare situation like Ben Tate, he may be available in like 25% of leagues. He may be out there. There hasn't really been a running back step up. I guess one real deep sleeper would be Tashard Choice, who recently got picked up by Washington. Kind of looks like Roy Halou is the favorite fantasy back there. He seems to put up the most yardage and kind of get the ball near the goal line. But why else would they pick up Tashard Choice in Washington? Like, what are the reason would they have to pick him up unless they were going to play him down the stretch? So maybe if you want to pick him up, if you have some other options for Week 12, you pick up Tashard Choice, stash him for a week or two, and maybe down the stretch here in the playoffs when you really need players to put together a victory, he may be available for you. But that's just, that's a deep prediction.
Yeah. What about receivers? I've got Devin Hester on my team, and I'm thinking, maybe it's time to switch things up a little bit. He really hasn't been, in my league, the way my league's set up anyway, really hasn't been doing what I would have liked him to see. Are there any sleeper receivers out there as we kind of head towards the final, 6 weeks of the season?
Well, if you can get I take it your league doesn't have return yards.
No.
Okay, so that's why Devin Hester is essentially worthless to you. There may be a guy like Denarius Moore from Oakland. Denarius Moore, Carson Palmer seems to have a rapport with Denarius Moore, and he's getting the ball. He's playing well the last couple weeks. I believe he's relatively owned. He may be another 25% availability, but Denarius Moore is certainly one guy that I really like that probably should start squeaking into your flex positions or your third wide receiver standard league format, because he has seemed to develop some type of rapport with Carson Palmer as his performance has peaked since Carson Palmer showed up in Oakland.
Okay, when I got one last question before I let Pete do his job again here. Someone in my league has got Matt Schaub on their bench, and they're set because they've actually got Aaron Rodgers as their starting quarterback. But at this point in the fantasy league season, do you think it might be necessary to pick up another backup starting quarterback, or do you think you might be able to just kind of coast and be all right for the rest of the year? Do they need another backup?
Well, my input there would always be if you have Aaron Rodgers, are you not going to start Aaron Rodgers?
Well, yeah, the only time that this person has not started Aaron Rodgers was the week of the bye. So
right. So does he? I guess my question would be: does that team need? I mean, Matt Schaub is on IR, right? So he's completely expendable. Now with Aaron Rodgers, if you're going to play him, well, Aaron Rodgers, barring season-ending injury, Aaron Rodgers is going to be out there. So I would think that person probably could use that roster spot to pick up another player. But if they're determined to have a backup quarterback, then I would think that there's a situation where somebody like that would pick up a Carson Palmer, would pick up another, maybe even Kyle Orton's not playing this week, but I look for Kyle Orton to take over under center for the Chiefs starting next week. So maybe there's a guy like that there as well that could fill in as a backup quarterback. But at this point in the year, if you have Aaron Rodgers, you're not going to bench Aaron Rodgers. So
yeah, exactly.
Well, with the exception of maybe the last couple of weeks, if the Packers decide to only play him for half the game or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
True. Yeah, so I mean, if that person is dead set on having an insurance policy and not just picking up somebody on an as-needed basis in the playoffs, then they would, in my opinion, my favorite guy down the stretch here, I mentioned it last week, my favorite guy is Carson Palmer. I still really like Carson Palmer down the stretch, even though we do have Vince Young kind of on a higher peak for this week. So, throw him in there, to me, as your insurance policy. He's probably the best insurance policy. And I think Carson Palmer's still out there in about 40% of leagues, so he's still available, widely available, and he's a heck of a fantasy option.
Okay, guys, I hate to do this to you, but, we were going to talk about Uncle Bob's favorite subject, fantasy's hottest football wives, but I tried to drop that little Laurie Schaub thing in there, but you guys went on and on and on. We'll have to pick this up next weekend, you hear?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, and maybe we could get something up on my site to promote this, too, okay? Listen, we're going to take a time out here. You're listening to Spadora Sports. Guys, have a great weekend.
Thank you.
You bet.
Yeah, you too.